Okay. So it's a box sizing module. So basically, Flexbox was added in CSS3, and it was added a few years ago to kind of give us a new way to display boxes, a new way to handle layout. So it's an entirely new feature in CSS, and the browsers have kind of caught up to implement it. Flexbox at this point is pretty much fully supported. Hits bottom at 92% of global traffic will support Flexbox. For US traffic, it's even higher. I think it's just like IE 9 and below that won't handle Flexbox, and some older mobile browsers as well can't do Flexbox. So it's pretty widely supported. I use Flexbox whenever I need to. I don't really think twice about it at this point. So it's really powerful to use. I've got some links here. This is just kind of for reference. This last one as well, flexboxfroggy.com. I'll publish this on Canvas as well. I really recommend learning Flexbox pretty well. We can't spend a ton of time on it in class, but I've been using it more and more lately. It's really, really powerful. So this flexboxfroggy.com is kind of a game, kind of like that first CSS game we did. Really similar, that kind of helps you learn the Flexbox concepts and kind of see them visually applied as you go along. So really, really powerful. I really recommend taking a look at that. So Flexbox starts with a container element. So we have what we call a flex container, and we apply display flex. So again, we've talked about the display property. We can do display none, or display block, display inline. We have a new value for display, which is display flex, and that's how we turn a container into a Flexbox container. And then it affects the way everything inside that box works. If I have to be super picky, I actually don't like that they use display for this. I wish they would have added a new property, because I find it confusing that display flex really affects the contents more than it affects the your container itself. But that's just me being picky. If I were on the committee that designed this, I would have done it a little bit differently. But so then we have additional rules like flex wrap and justify content that we can add to the container, which will affect how the elements inside are displayed. So again, these are rules we can apply to a container that then affect all the elements inside. So that's what's really powerful about it, is we don't have to go in and say, okay, every element float left, and do all these kinds of things. We can just say, okay, in this div, make all of the elements inside behave this certain way. And then we have a lot of options for how we can control that behavior. We also have rules like flex, where we can give some specific things, even order, that we can apply to the elements inside the Flexbox. So not only can we set some settings on the container itself, but we can also set some settings on the elements inside. Change how much space they take up, things like that. So we can do column layouts with Flexbox relatively simply. So here's an example where we've got a div with class box, and then inside it we have 3 divs, one of which has some extra text inside of it. So if you think about the way this would normally work, each div would get its own line, right? Each div would be on a new line. But if we target the box and we say display flex, now everything is inline. So that's really powerful. And you'll notice also the default behavior is that it's expanded the height of the first 2 elements to match the height of the third element. So those first 2 elements, they should only have however much height they need for their content, right? They won't by default, expand that way. But because we've done display flex, they will automatically expand to match the other elements inside that box. And we can control how this works. There's an option to turn that off, or an option to change the way it works. But really powerful, just one rule that we've applied, and it's changed the entire layout inside of that container to something at least really different. Here's another example of using display flex. So similar thing, we've got a container div, we've got 3 divs inside it. Each of those kind of elements inside has a width of 200 pixels. So again, if you think about how this would normally look, each div would have a new line, right? their display block, we would just have 3 divs on the page. It would say 1, 2, 3. They would still have the width, but they wouldn't be inline like this. So if we do display flex, that will allow them to kind of display more inline like this. Then also this flex wrap will allow it to just continue to a new line when it needs to. So again, really powerful instead of just kind of taking up, going outside of the width of the div. Here's another couple of examples, and these are really powerful as well. So we can say display flex and then say justify content center. So again, this is where, in the past you might have been tempted to use text align to try and do something like this, where we could align text center. And we've talked about how really the only other way we have to center elements is to do the margin left auto, margin right auto. So here we can just target our box container. We say display flex, and then we can say justify content center. That justify content is a brand new property that we have where we can center the actual content. So that's really, really powerful. We really, in the past, had no good way of doing this. It was really, really difficult to take elements like divs and say, okay, all of these divs in here, center them. You'd have to go through each one and do the margin left kind of thing, and it was just kind of a hassle. So this is really, really powerful. We can say justify content center. Any divs inside of that box container will be centered. Here's another example where instead of justify content center, we can do justify content space evenly. And now you'll notice they're not centered, but they're evenly spaced in the space they have available to them. That's also really powerful. This kind of thing was also very, very difficult to do in CSS before Flexbox. If you try and do this without bringing in Flexbox, it's really, really tricky. So really powerful. Just 2 simple rules is all we had to apply, and this HTML turns into that layout. So really powerful. You can see where this is useful for things like columns, right? So we can create a 3-column layout just by having 3 divs and by doing justify content space evenly. And everything's going to be liquid. On a smaller screen, they're going to still be centered, but spaced evenly. So really, really powerful stuff. Again, I can't go over all the options because Flexbox there's a lot of stuff, but really powerful to use. Here's another example where we can give some different, what we call flex dimensions. So we can say display flex, and then on each element itself, we can set how much space it should take. And it's relative to the amount of space available to it. So box 1, we've said flex 2, box 2 is flex 1, and then box 3 is flex 2. So the way it works is it's like a fraction. So by saying flex 2, we're saying take up 2 out of however many total spaces we have. So you can kind of calculate, you can add them all up. So here we've got 5 total spaces. So the first one would be 2 out of 5, the second would be 1 out of 5, and the third would be 2 out of 5. So again, this is how we can create a column layout with different sized columns. So we've got, one column that's wider, we've got a slimmer column in the middle, and then a wider column at the end. And all we've had to do is say, take up, 2 out of whatever, 1 out of whatever, 2 out of whatever. Really, really powerful. I'm going to go back to the reference slide real quick. So this page right here, the CSS tricks page, is really, really helpful to understanding Flexbox, and they break things out. So if you're on this page, you can expand this, by the way, if you want to, kind of read more on the background or read more on the terminology. You can expand these sections. But then everything here on the left are properties that we apply to the parent, to our container. So things like display flex. There's flex direction. So flex direction is really powerful. I used this just the other day on a project where on mobile, I just changed the flex direction. I went from columns to more of a vertical layout. Super powerful. So you can change whether your elements should be in a row or be in a column. Really great. So again, all of these here on the left are these that we would apply to the container, to our flex box. And then all of these properties here on the right are elements or properties we set on the children, so on our items inside our container. So this would be our div 1, 2, 3, that kind of thing. So again, there's all kinds of properties. We can set the order. Flex grow can indicate whether or not it should automatically grow or not. Again, really useful things. Align self is also useful. We can do some vertical alignment with Flexbox, which again is really new and helpful. And then they've got some examples down here on the bottom as well. So again, really great site for understanding Flexbox. Again, this Flexbox Froggy is really good as well, kind of giving you some repetition, understanding how to use Flexbox. So they'll kind of give you the information on what you need. I think this is level 2, but they'll kind of talk about what options you have, and then you can write the CSS and write the Flexbox rules to achieve whatever they're asking you to do. So I don't know what they're wanting. Move the frog to the right. So justify content flex end. So again, really nice. I really recommend it especially if you're wanting to go into web development as professionally. I really recommend Flexbox. It's really powerful. Excuse me, really powerful. And again, it's kind of beyond the scope of what we can really go over all the options in class, so it's kind of up to you to learn. You can use Flexbox in any of your assignments as well, by the way, so feel free to do that. Okay, after Flexbox, so CSS Grid is another kind of layout module that's been added. It's slightly newer than Flexbox, but it's been around maybe 2-3 years at this point. It's not quite as fully supported, so it's about 85% of global web traffic will support CSS Grid. The problem with CSS Grid is IE 11 has some issues with it. I think that's it. By the way, caniuse.com is a really awesome website. So it's just caniuse.com, and then you can look up certain CSS features or certain JavaScript features, and it'll tell you what browsers support that feature. So for instance, this is the CSS Grid one, and we can see that like here, IE 11, it says partial support. And it's also partial support for an older version of the spec. So it's like an older version of CSS Grid that IE 11 supports. So I don't use CSS Grid yet on professional projects where I know I have some legacy support necessary. We've started a new project at work, and I really wanted to use CSS Grid, and I really pushed for it, and we're like, no, we've got a lot of existing kind of enterprise users. We really can't take the risk of someone still using IE 11, because if you're on like Windows 7, you're probably using IE 11 still, so not quite full support yet there. But you'll see that like Chrome and Firefox and Safari, all of those are green. Opera Mini, I'm not sure if anyone's used that. BlackBerry, if anyone still has a BlackBerry, BlackBerry doesn't support CSS Grid. So like if we look up Flexbox, up here you can just search. So the flexible box layout module, we'll see that it's quite a bit better. It's still provisional on IE 11 just because there's some bugs present, but I found that it actually works pretty good. But we can see a lot better overall for Flexbox. And then over here is where it'll show the traffic percentage that uses a supported browser. So again, really powerful. I use this all the time. Again, so we chose to use Flexbox, and I pulled up this page and showed my bosses like, okay, CSS Grid maybe not quite, but Flexbox, we're talking about 91% of US traffic is going to be able to support it. So then we can make a decision of, okay, are we willing to sacrifice those 10% of users to be able to do some cool stuff. So again, you can even do like different JavaScript stuff. So any new kind of thing you hear about, new CSS thing or new browser feature, you can look it up here and it'll kind of tell you where it's supported. So really useful. So CSS Grid. A little bit different than Flexbox, achieves a lot of the same things. Flexbox is more centered around, let's take a container and then let's lay out the items in the container in a certain way. So Flexbox is really designed for like, maybe you've got a menu and you've got a div and you've got buttons inside and you want to affect how those buttons are laid out, how they're arranged. That's kind of what Flexbox is good at. We can use it for bigger things like columns, and I've used Flexbox for my whole page as a Flex container, and I've got, you know, column divs that are laid out in a certain way. So Flexbox is powerful enough to do that stuff, but it's really designed to handle a container that's filled with certain types of elements that we want to arrange in a certain way. CSS Grid is really more designed for those bigger layout things. So CSS Grid is saying, okay, you know, how do I really create a layout for my page and then put, you know, container divs inside it. So a lot of times what we would do, and kind of what the future idea is we'll use CSS Grid to do our overall layout, and then we'll do Flexbox kind of as we need within our layout to kind of handle smaller elements, things like that. So here's an example of how CSS Grid works. It's really nice. We, you know, again, instead of doing floats where we're having to target the columns themselves and say, okay, width so much, float left, whatever, with CSS Grid, we target our container, and then we give it a grid system, and then the content automatically will flow in that grid system. So we target our container div, and we can do things like grid template columns, and we can define 3 columns. And there's different ways here we can define the columns. We can say one column is 50% wide, one column is 100 pixels wide, and then one column is, this is it's a fractional. So it's really similar to the flex property. So this one, it's just one out of however many there are left. So this would be 1/3, or 1 out of 3. Or actually, if it's one fractional at the end, it's just saying any remaining space. So and you can mix and match these. You could say 50%, 50%, or you could say 33%, 25%, and then whatever else you need. One fractional at the end just says any remaining space. My last column will do that. So here we've defined our columns. We've got a 50% width column, we've got a 100% or 100 pixel width column, and then we've got a 1 fractional column taking up the remaining space. We can also define our rows in our thing. We can define 2 rows, a 100 pixel row and a 200 pixel row. And we can also set the gap setting. So we can say grid gap 200 or 20 pixels. So there's going to be 20 pixels of gap in between our columns and in between our rows. And now whatever content, whatever divs we have inside of this div container, based on their order, they will fill these slots. So the first div will go in our first 50% column and on our first 100 pixel row. Our second div will go in the 100 pixel column and the 100 pixel row. Our third div will take up that third space. Our fourth div then is going to be in the first column but the second row, so on and so forth. So we don't have to do any styles on the divs themselves that go in the columns. We just set the rules on the container and say, here's what columns you should have, and then the content will automatically fill in the gaps. Really, really useful. So again, here's an example where we've got a div ID grid, so we target that grid, we say display grid, and then we can do grid template columns, 50 pixels, and then 1 fractional. So again, just being whatever the remaining space is. And then, you know, we've got our 2 divs inside that, and the first one takes up the first column, and the second one takes up the second column. We don't have to do anything special CSS-wise to each of the columns. Yeah, question?
Will it only work on divs inside of div, or will it work on elements as well?
Yeah, it'll work on any elements. Good question. It may only be block level elements. Like if you have like a link or something, it may not apply to that. It's a good question though. But yeah, you can use other HTML5 elements or images and stuff like that. I believe will work. We might have to look into that though. I've used CSS Grid a few times, but it's so new. You know, a lot of us are still kind of learning it as well. So again, we can use different units to create our columns, which is really handy. So we can do, you know, just pixel columns, 60 pixels, 60 pixels to create 2 60 pixel columns. We can use percentages if we wanted to do 3 columns with percentages. We also have these fractionals. So again, it kind of works the same way as the Flexbox. If we do 1 fractional, 1 fractional, 1 fractional, this is 1 out of 1 plus 1 plus 1. So 1 out of 3, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 3. Or we can do 1 out of 1 plus 2, which would be 1 out of 3, and then 2 out of 1 plus 2, or 2 out of 3. So again, that's really nice. And then you can also use the fractional stuff with percentages. So we could say 25%, 1 fractional, 2 fractional works very similarly. So again, that seems kind of confusing, but it's a really powerful kind of new unit that we have, where you can just kind of, you don't have to even do the percentage math, which is nice because say you wanted to add a column, you don't have to then go and adjust and say, okay, now instead of, say you want to go from a 3 column to a 4 column, you don't have to say, okay, change all my 33% to 25%. You just add one more 1 FR, and it automatically changes it for you. You don't have to adjust all of your percentages. So I really like it for that reason. Here's another example. Again, we've got display grid template columns, 100 pixel, 100 pixel, 100 pixel. And we set our grid gap, so that's going to add that gap both in between our columns and our rows. You'll notice the rows are automatic here. Once we fill all 3 columns, it just breaks down to a new row. So you can specify what your row height should be, or you can just not set it, and it'll just automatically add new rows when you need to. So that's really nice as well. Similar example, display grid, 1 fractional, 2 fractional, 3 fractional. We see we've got 1 out of 6, 2 out of 6, and then 3 out of 6. And again, we could just add 1 to that by saying 1 fractional, 2 fractional, 3 fractional, 1 fractional, if we wanted another 1 out of whatever the total is. So really, really powerful when you get into it. Here's another example. You can also specify, again, by default here, our divs just fill up the spaces in order. But we can also specify which grid space a certain item should fill. So, item 1, we can say grid column 2, grid row 2. And now item 1 here is in the second column, the second row. So if we want to, we can really specify which area a certain div should fill. Here, grid column 3, grid row 1. So 4 is up there in that top right corner. So that's kind of useful too, especially when we get into mobile stuff, and we'll talk about how to do mobile responsive stuff here in a little bit. We could say on mobile, grid column 3, grid row 4. On desktop, grid row 1, grid column 1, if we wanted to change the way that looks on those different layouts. You can even name areas, so you could create a column and a row and say, okay, this is the footer, and then you can tell things go in the footer, stuff like that as well. So again, that's a super brief overview of what is a very large topic. The Mozilla page on CSS Grid is really useful. Show you what that looks like. So they show you a lot of examples. I've pulled a lot of my examples from there. So if you want to kind of see those, all kinds of things you can do, and they give you the CSS to do it as well. There also is a CSS Grid game. I don't think I have a link to it. Yeah, again, all of these links are really good. Common UI patterns in CSS Grid. So if you want to kind of see certain patterns that are often used, like these are all kind of common page layouts. Say, okay, yeah, I want to use this layout. They'll show you what the CSS Grid settings would be. Here in CodePen, so really nice. You can see what their CSS is to achieve that layout. So super useful. If you search CSS Grid game, I'll publish it on Canvas. I know I've got the link there. Yeah, Grid Garden. Really similar to that Flexbox thing where, go back to level 1, they'll tell you what to do. They'll tell you what your goal is, and then you can fill out the CSS to do it. So really cool, and it gets kind of complicated. But they walk through all the steps, and they give you the options that you need to do. So we don't do this as a lab in class or anything, but I really recommend going through this just to kind of learn that skill. So again, with the combination of, there's sometimes one project recently I did it all in CSS Grid, and then we realized, oh, we really do want to have that a little bit more backwards compatible support. So I had to go back and change it all to Flexbox. And you can achieve the same things, honestly. They just work slightly different. So again, these are kind of tools in the toolbox. Want you to at least be familiar with them. You may encounter them in the professional world if you go into professional development. Okay, any questions about Flexbox or CSS Grid? Again, they're optional for you to use in future assignments. I recommend learning them, but I'm not requiring you to. They're not going to be covered on quizzes other than like what are some options to do column layouts, and so Flexbox would be an option that you could answer with. But other than that, I'm not going to, ask any detailed questions on them or anything. Okay, let's jump into mobile responsiveness. So a lot of what we've talked about so far hasn't really helped us other than maybe liquid layouts. We haven't really talked about, we have established that mobile users are important and that we should really, consider them and take them seriously, but we haven't really talked about how to adopt our layouts for mobile users. So we'll talk about that now. So we can use what are called media queries to adjust our CSS or to provide different CSS for different types of screen sizes and different types of users. So again, we apply styles only when certain conditions are true. So it's kind of like an if statement for your CSS. You can say if screen size is greater than whatever, apply this style. We have all different types of conditions we can use. We can do device type, so you can target, print, which is common, like if you've got a blog or something like that and you want to style it differently when people print out your blog, remove the background image, stuff like that. That's pretty common. We can target screens or even screen readers. We can also target device size by width or height. Typically, we'll target device size by width as the most common media query we'll use. But you can also target by height or even resolution or screen orientation. So you can have different layouts for landscape mode phones versus portrait mode phones because you may want to adjust things a little bit differently. There's also newer device features that we can target in media queries as well. This is kind of a newer feature, but we can target whether they have a pointer, like a mouse pointer, or whether it's a touch device. We can even target light level now. That's kind of a newer feature. Phones have light sensors, so they can tell you if they're in a bright room or a dark room, and maybe you adjust the theme based on that. There's also, like on your phones now, and even now with the new Mac OS, there's a dark mode that you can turn on if you want, your everything to kind of be inverted. We can actually detect that now in some cases. It's not as widely supported. I think Safari supports it in Chrome, but not other than that. So you can actually detect if the device is in dark mode, and then you could make your website dark mode. So that's a really useful feature. We can also target some JavaScript features as well, so we can tell if they support certain JavaScript features. Here's a demo that I think this shows us what the so this is just where you can see some of the different media queries, and then as you adjust the screen, you'll see the color change once it gets smaller. So just as kind of a demo. So that's where we've done at media. Well, I'll go over all the details for this, but we can say min width 400 pixels. So anything greater. So min width is basically saying greater than 400 pixels. We also have max width. That's kind of more of a less than. So we can just change the background color based on what the size is. So we can also use media queries in the link tag to only include a CSS file if a particular condition is true. I'll use this now for larger sites. The CSS can get kind of crazy when you've got a lot of media queries. So if I've got a really large site and I've got a lot of mobile specific rules, I'll actually pull all my mobile styles into a separate CSS file and then do a link, and then you can say media equals, and then you can provide some rules that CSS file will only be included if those conditions are true. You have to be kind of careful because, again, now you're separating different CSS, and you can kind of get into trouble with it because now you have to update certain things to places. But again, if you've got a ton of mobile styles, that's a good idea to do. So actually using media queries. So you use the @media rule to do this. And then we provide whatever the rule is inside parentheses. And then inside our brackets, we provide the actual CSS that we want to be applied when that condition is true. So we've got @media, min width 400 pixels, and then our curly brackets, and then anything inside here is what gets applied when that condition is true. So again, min width is kind of a greater than situation. So if the width is greater than 400 pixels, this will be applied because the minimum width that it'll be applied at is 400 pixels. We can also, I don't think I talked specifically about max width, but we also have max width, which is, again, more of a less than. So at the maximum width this rule will be applied at is whatever you give it. So anything less than that will see that rule. So we can also use logical operators. So we can do commas for and, we can use and or as well as like only and not. I try not to get into this too much because it can get kind of complicated. But for instance, you can say min width 400 pixels and max width 800 pixels. So it'll be anything between 400 pixels and 800 pixels. This rule will be applied. So we can combine those using and. Here's how we would do an or. So we can do min width 600 pixels or using a comma orientation landscape. So this would be anything that's bigger than 600 pixels or if it's orientation landscape. You could target those two different things. And this is an example of what we might do. We might want to change the font size of our headings, something like that on mobile. So again, we'll use these to create responsive designs that will adapt to different screen sizes, right? So we want to think about kind of all the different types of screens that we need to support. And so we often call these breakpoints. So this is kind of the screen sizes where we want our layout to change. So again, we can't really account for every single device. We can't say, okay, on an iPhone 6, on an iPhone 6 Plus, on an iPhone 7, on an iPhone 7 Plus, because they're all slightly different, right? Never mind Android and the millions of options there. Like every device is kind of different. You've got tablets, you've got laptops. We can't say, okay, on this specific device, do this thing. But what we kind of do is we try to generalize. So we try and say, okay, between this size and this size, do this thing, and then between this size and this size, do another thing. So we kind of generalize when we're doing responsive design. So again, we kind of target classes. So again, we'll think of mobile, tablet, and desktop typically. Sometimes we'll break it down even more and say mobile landscape, or mobile portrait, mobile landscape, tablet portrait, tablet landscape, and then maybe laptop, and then desktop, and then maybe even now ultra-wide desktop, because those are popular. So if you really want to get, you can get as specific as you think you need to based on your site. So that's kind of a decision you have to make. Typically, just kind of some rules of thumb, desktops and laptops are generally going to be greater than 1025 pixels, just as a general rule of thumb. Landscape phones and tablets are usually 481 to 1024. Again, these are generalized. These are just kind of based on some statistics, averages. So I'll use things like that sometimes. 41 to 1024 is going to be your tablets or a larger phone in landscape mode. Because again, phones are pretty big now. So a landscape phone is honestly, some of them are not that much narrower than a laptop or a small laptop even. And then portrait phones, usually anything less than 480 pixels, you can be pretty sure that's a normal orientation phone. I reference this all the time. This link here provides a lot of breakdowns. again, kind of just using best practices, using some averages. So I'll pull this up and just copy certain rules from it if I need to. So he'll list the device and list the screen as well. So for desktops, he's saying min width 1281. Here's for laptops and desktops, saying min width 1025 and max width 1280. So again, you can kind of mix and match these as you need. So again, I use this as a reference. I find it really valuable. He usually keeps it up to date too. It goes back to 2017, and there's been some revisions. So anyway, I use this link if you need to, if you want to get really specific or even broad. You could just say min width 1025 and remove this max width if you just wanted to say laptop and up. So really useful. And again, he gets down into portrait, smartphones, maybe low resolution tablets or landscape mobiles, things like that. Really useful resource. So again, these are called breakpoints. Breakpoints are the deciding points that you've set where the layout will adjust. So 480 pixels would be a breakpoint that says, okay, once we hit 480 pixels, things change. That's why we call them a breakpoint. One of the most common things that we'll do in layouts is do responsive columns. So we'll kind of combine our media queries with our column layouts to have the column numbers adjust based on our device size. So here's an example, just a really super basic example where each of these boxes just has class column. We've said width 50% and float left. So we've created a 2-column layout, right? This could be scaled up to be a normal, full width size, but we've got a 2-width column layout here. But then maybe on mobile, so media max width 480 pixels, so everything less than 480, we would say on our column, say width 100% and then float none. So now we're adjusting it from a 2-column layout to a 1-column layout on mobile. It's a really common pattern to say, okay, once we get on a small size, there's no longer room for 2 50% columns or 4 25% columns, so we'll adjust it. You might adjust from width 25% to width 50% on mobile. I've done that as well. Maybe go from a 4-column layout to a 2-column layout. This also is really powerful when we're using Flexbox or CSS Grid. We can have our media query, and then we can just change that grid template column setting and just change the number of columns on the container, and it'll automatically adjust for us. So really, really useful. Also, if you're using Flexbox, you can change like the flex direction from row to column on mobile. That's been super powerful. That's saved my life a few times. Not literally, but it's made my life a lot easier for doing mobile responsiveness. Again, here's an example of doing that actually, using CSS Grid. So we've got CSS Grid, grid template columns. I didn't mention this repeat before, but you can actually do this repeat. You say how many times you want it to repeat, and then you say what you want to repeat. So I'm saying repeat 4 times 1 fractional. So it's the same as doing grid template columns, 1 fractional, 1 fractional, 1 fractional, 1 fractional. I probably shouldn't use a more advanced thing like that, but that's also an option for use. So then we could say, okay, on tablet, so min width 481, max width 1024, just change our grid template columns to repeat 2 times 1 fractional. So we'll have 1 fractional, 1 fractional, so 2 50% columns. Then here we can say on max width 480%, grid template columns 1 fractional. So just have 1 column. So now we've got a desktop, a tablet, and a mobile layout. And this is all the CSS that was required to do that, right? Just these media queries and 1 rule, just changing the grid template column setting if we're using CSS Grid. You can do similar things with Flexbox. Super, super useful. Some more examples here in this code pen as well if you want to look at it. I'll just show, we'll talk about SAS a little bit later, but so this is a site that I'm working on, so don't judge it, it's a work in progress, but if we look at the breakpoint, so we've got kind of our, this is kind of our desktop view. We've got really just a tablet and then a mobile. So once we kind of hit tablet in here, things will change a little bit. So once we hit that breakpoint, we center this. We don't do, yeah, like, so this part goes from a 2-column layout here to just being 1 column, like this. And really that's just because as it even gets smaller, you know, there's no longer room for those 2 columns. And then once we hit, yeah, like kind of here's where we hit, you know, it'll go from this kind of 2-column layout here to just being this 1 column kind of for small tablet down. So, you know, I'll show you the CSS for that. It's in this one. This is Sass, so it's going to look, there's some stuff in here. We'll talk about Sass in just a minute. But, and again, the CSS is a little bit messy, so don't judge me. Again, it's a work in progress. Oh, and also I'm using Sass variables here. So I've actually got a Sass file called breakpoints where I provide the 3 different breakpoints I want to use. I've used a little bit different than what I've talked about, but I've got a small, a medium, and a large, and I'm setting variables here. And so then in my Sass here, I can say, you know, at medium, min width, medium, display none. And I just applied that to a class. But let's see, where's some good examples? Here's a good example of where I did flexbox. So at max width small, so max width small is going to be medium and up, basically. So if it's medium up, do flex direction column. So that will, it changes the flex direction to be a column layout. So anyway, I guess I don't have any, like, I'm trying to see. Yeah, here's again where I'm doing flex direction column, doing width. Had to do important here because of some bootstrap stuff. So it's kind of an example. I've kind of got my media queries sort of mixed throughout my CSS and saying, okay, make this adjustment on this specific screen size. So again, at some point I probably need to go through here and kind of reorganize things a little bit, and you know, it's a little bit crazy, but here's just an example of how we'll use the media queries kind of throughout. One thing we talked about a little bit was box sizing. So again, when you're dealing with column layouts, often you'll notice that your margin and padding kind of throw off things like your widths. And so by default, they're included in the calculation of your sizes. So again, as we talked about, you can use the box sizing property to adjust that. So the default behavior is content box. So that's where all of the content is included in the calculation of the width. Or box sizing border box. It includes the padding and the border still, but not the margin in the width. So again, the CSS tricks link is really helpful for kind of digging into that and understanding it. Just know that there's those 2 different options there you can use. Okay, some more resources for media queries. Again, I've kind of just given you a brief introduction into media queries. There's a lot of other options out there. These resources are all really good. This first link here, the Mozilla Developer Network, is going to be probably your most detailed documentation page. So if you want to really get into the weeds and you need some really precise documentation, this page is going to be the most helpful. So they'll talk about all the options that you have here. If you want kind of a simpler explanation, these 2 W3 schools pages will be kind of helpful if you just kind of need to understand it as a concept a little bit better. Those would be some good resources. I've got a couple of demos here as well. So I really like this page too, this responsive design .is. I kind of use this for inspiration sometimes. They just have a lot of different articles kind of talking about responsive design. They'll keep up with the browsers and how they're adapting things. So again, really good for just kind of getting some inspiration and some ideas. Because again, design is kind of subjective, and what looks best on different devices is also kind of subjective. So some of it's just kind of figuring out what you think works best. And the CSS gives you the tools to accomplish that. Okay, we talked about CSS frameworks a little bit already, but again, there's some pros to them. They're very quick and easy to create new websites and UIs. Typically, our framework's going to be really well tested across different browsers. That's one of the things I appreciate about them. If you're using Bootstrap, you typically can be sure that it's going to work the same every time. We also have third-party resources like different code examples. If you're using Bootstrap, you can Google, Bootstrap login form, and somebody probably has already built a login form using Bootstrap that shows you how to do it. Or Bootstrap carousel, things like that. They kind of have some resources for you that you can find. So that's helpful. Even complete themes. You can buy some CSS themes that will apply to a Bootstrap page that change the way that it looks and the way that it works. So that's nice. Some cons, again, you're dependent on what's available in the framework. If you try and do something that the framework doesn't provide, you might start to run into problems. You're also dependent on the design choices of the framework. If you don't like the way Bootstrap buttons work, you can restyle them a little bit, but now you're fighting Bootstrap, right? I run into this all the time at work. If we use Bootstrap on a couple different projects, and we'll say, okay, let's really customize the way that button works. But we're not starting from scratch and just applying styles. We're having to undo things that Bootstrap did on the button. So not only are you, writing your styles, but you're also kind of like writing anti-styles in a sense. So it can get kind of tricky, and so that's a big thing to keep in mind. You'll also have really complicated HTML sometimes with lots of classes. Bootstrap is really class heavy. You're adding classes for everything. Your HTML may start to get a little bit crazy. Again, difficult to override framework styles. You usually have to use important more often than you'd like. Also, larger amounts of CSS does slow your website down a little bit. Your browser has to read all of that CSS and has to apply all those styles. So Bootstrap does add some page load time, both from the downloading the CSS file and then as well as just applying all of those styles. So something to keep in mind as well. So again, we talked about Bootstrap. Bootstrap v4, which came out about a year and a half ago maybe, uses Flexbox. So, and there's actually a lot of, they give you a lot of classes that will apply the Flexbox features. So instead of writing your own Flexbox CSS, you can just use Bootstrap classes and get a lot of the Flexbox features. So that's really nice. Really robust layout for mobile. So with Bootstrap, you can do all kinds of mobile responsive things just using classes without writing any CSS. So super nice. Lots of pre-styled components. They've got a library of JavaScript features. It does use jQuery, so that's a dependency, but things like modals, like a pop-up or a drop-down, even a carousel that'll rotate automatically, Bootstrap gives that for you, which is nice. Also a lot of utility classes. So if you want to do floats, they actually give you a class for float left. It's like pull left or something like that, and it'll apply float left for you. Again, just keeps you from writing CSS and you're adding classes instead. Positioning, alignment, even screen reader support. Bootstrap's also really good at accessibility, so they have a lot of built-in screen reader support. You can add some classes that will identify what your element is to a screen reader. So Bootstrap has helped me understand how to better design and better have accessible HTML. So just from a lot of the patterns they follow. So I recommend looking into it for that as well. So again, here's kind of an example with Bootstrap. We could say column 12 just with the class, and then we can say call medium 8. So on a medium screen, make it 8 columns, but the default will be 12. And you can get even more precise than that, but just kind of an example of how Bootstrap will work. Another example, this is where we can use, these are Flexbox things, so align self-start, align self-center, align self-end. Bootstrap's giving those features to us as classes where we can have 3 columns, but we can adjust where they sit within the overall div, which is nice. And also really powerful, something that used to be very hard to do. Used to, if we wanted something like that kind of a layout, we'd have to do a lot of margin stuff, like margin top 25%, stuff like that, and it got really crazy really quick. So really nice that Flexbox gives us this, and Bootstrap even further lets you just add a class, and it will do it for you. Just an example where they have a rounded class. And again, we know what it's doing. It's just adding border radius, but it's one class you can add to any element, and it'll add that border radius for you. Bootstrap buttons. So again, they give you all of these different types of buttons. You can override the colors and stuff if you'd like. Modals. So again, for using Bootstrap, again, which I really recommend using Bootstrap for this next assignment, the Instagram clone one, it really makes things a lot easier, especially your layout and especially your mobile responsive stuff. So I really recommend it. You don't have to, but I would recommend digging into it. So this getsbootstrap.com is where you can get it. So they've got this getting started introduction. You want to include the Bootstrap CSS before all of your CSS files. And then you also probably want to include the Bootstrap JavaScript too. And we include it right before the closing body tag. So right before your closing body tag is where you want to put those script includes. And then here's the Bootstrap documentation. Again, when I'm working on a Bootstrap site, I always have the documentation open in another tab, and I'm always referencing it. It's super useful. And then, yeah, search the web for examples as well. So again, someone else has probably already done what you're trying to do in Bootstrap. So super useful. I'll just show you this real fast. The getting started page. So what they do is they'll give you the CSS link here. So you're loading the CSS from their domain. So you don't have to download the file or anything. You're using an absolute URL to load it from their content. So you can just copy this whole link and put it into your head. And then you can copy, same with their JavaScript, you can copy these 3 JavaScript source include lines and put it right below your closing body. They give you this kind of starter template as well. So if you wanted to just copy all of this HTML, it includes that for you. So it includes their style sheet and it includes their JavaScript. So that's how you get started using Bootstrap. But now you can use their classes throughout. Okay, any questions about Bootstrap? Cool. Again, it's optional for you. For the Instagram assignment, the one coming up, you can use CSS Grid, you can use Flexbox, you can use Bootstrap, really up to you. I want you to kind of, do some research, figure out what you want to try, and give it a shot. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Sass. Sass is something that we won't really use in class unless you want to. It requires some additional tooling, but Sass is really awesome, and it's also really popular, really common in the industry, so I want you to at least be familiar with it. So Sass stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. It's a CSS extension language, so it's basically takes CSS and adds a bunch of stuff to it. But it has to be compiled before it can be rendered by the browser. So the browsers don't support Sass. Browsers don't know anything about Sass, but you compile Sass on your laptop, and it turns it all into plain CSS for you. So that's where you have to have some additional tooling. You have to have some software that will compile your Sass for you. So again, here's the Sass website and some stuff. Less is really similar to Sass, kind of an alternative. Sass is seems to have won out. Most people use Sass now. And again, so there's lots of variables, lots of features that we've added, things like variables that I showed you before that we can do. So just a few examples of things that Sass gives us that are really nice. One is variables in our CSS. Especially once you get longer CSS, you're getting a bigger site, it's getting more complicated. You may find that you really would like to reference the same value often in your code. Sass lets us do this using variables. So over here we can say, here's our font stack, here's our heading size, here's our primary color, and then we can reference those in our CSS. You can say H1, font family is font stack, font size is heading size, color is primary color, and reference those variables throughout our CSS. And that all gets compiled into that. Like it just replaces the variables and it compiles into plain CSS for us that we include in our page. We can also do nesting. This is one of my favorite features. I think it makes a lot of sense. So instead of, over here on the right would be plain CSS where we'd have like nav. Then if we want to style the UL inside our nav, that's a separate selector, nav space UL, and then nav space UL space LI. In Sass, we can nest those together. So we can say nav And then inside of our nav, we can say UL and give another curly braces and provide some stuff. Inside our UL, we can say LI and provide curly braces. So we can nest our selectors. Super, super useful. We can also do, we can reference the parent element and add additional selectors using the ampersand. I use this all the time as well. So we can target our A, and then we can say and A : hover. So basically whenever we put the and sign, it just brings in the original selector and adds to it. So this is saying and A with hover state. So I like this a little bit better. Instead of saying A and then later saying A hover, we can include the hover part nested inside of our original rule. I think it's kind of nice. We can also do mix-in, so these are kind of little functions, reusable sections of SAS that we can import, and they can also take variables as well. So this is really powerful for things like our column layouts or things like CSS Grid. So we could create a mix-in called create columns and give it however many columns we want as a variable. And then it returns this CSS. So display grid template columns is just repeat whatever our number of columns that was passed in is, and then one fractional. So if we pass in 6, it'll say, repeat 6, one fractional, or one fractional, one fractional, one fractional, one fractional, 6 times. Our other settings, grid gap. So now we can say, okay, blog section, include create columns 3. So it'll pull in the CSS and include it here with whatever parameter we passed. Then on our new section, we can say include create columns 4. Really, really nice. It keeps us from repeating those same 4 lines everywhere throughout our code. Another thing that's really nice about this, let's say you do a bunch of development, and then you decide, oh, I used grid gap 10 pixels. Maybe I actually want that to be 15 pixels instead. If you didn't use a mix-in, you'd have to go through your CSS, find anywhere you did this grid template columns in your grid gap and update it. Here you only have to update it one place, and it affects everywhere else that you've used it. So super, super useful. I really like using mix-ins. Again, it just compiles to regular CSS, right? Like your SAS compiler just says, okay, how do I turn this into regular CSS? So these are kind of just like tools that make your life easier as a developer. Other SAS files, we can import things like partials, which allows us to modularize our SAS. Again, an example of that, in mine, I've got these 2 files. I've got like my breakpoints. This was just kind of the starting point. I've also got like a global SAS file where I set some things like colors, and then I can import those in other places. So in other SAS files, I can import my breakpoints, and then I have all of those variables available to me. I can try to see where I import the import breakpoints and import global. So I can import those kind of partial files, and then I have that available to me as well. So really nice for things like variables, and then you can pull those same variables in to all of your other SAS files. Super nice. We've got mix-ins. You can also do math in SAS, so that's really nice as well. So if you want to say, use a variable for setting width, and then you want to say margin equals your width times 0.1, so it's like 10% of your width. You can do stuff like that in SAS, and again, it just compiles it for you. Full documentation is here if you want to look at the full SAS documentation. So using SAS, how do we actually use SAS? We need something to pre-process the SAS and convert it into regular CSS. So Scout is one option. So basically there's several different options for the software to do that. Scout is one. It's a good desktop app. It's really easy to understand how it works. You basically just say, okay, here's my SAS, my directory that includes the SAS. Here's my output directory. This is where I want all my CSS to go. And it'll detect changes in your SAS files, and then it'll write them to the CSS for you automatically. So keep in mind, in your HTML, you load the CSS. Like in your HTML, you have to load a CSS file, not a Sass file. So we use some tool that will run that says, okay, convert all my Sass into CSS and compile it. There's also some command line options. So the Sass one itself, Compass is one that I use. Or if you're using, Node.js, there's also tools like Gulp and Grunt that are kind of like task runners that will do this for you. Those are kind of more command line tools, so they're a little bit more complicated. We keep our Sass in .scss files. And then the preprocessors, again, they'll typically look for any changes, and they'll automatically run once you've saved new changes and update. And often they'll even refresh the page for you as well, which is really nice. So again, some additional resources if you want to dig into it. Again, it's not required to use Sass in class. I've really kind of just given you an intro. But especially if you're going to go into professional development, it's really, really common. I use Sass on all my professional projects. So something you probably want to be familiar with and maybe dig into and try and use for a project if you want. So just keep in mind, you're going to have to figure out what kind of processor you want, how to install it, how to get it to run. You're going to have to do some setup with that to get it to convert stuff for you. Okay, so that's all we've got for today. Again, on Tuesday we'll do the quiz, and then we'll do a CSS positioning lab. So we'll kind of do position relative, position absolute kind of things in that lab. And yeah, the study guide is on Canvas. I'll publish these slides as well on Canvas, and I'll publish the Flexbox and the CSS Grid links to those games as well if you want to check those out. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you next week. Hey, how's it going?
Good. So if I want to use Go, I would need to have already a Sass preprocessor. I could just use Gulp and
Yeah, so Gulp will run your Sass processor. And so usually, if you just kind of do some research into Gulp, there's Node Sass, I think it is one that's a Node.js Sass compiler, and Gulp will run that for you from the command line. So that's what I look into is Node Sass. There's also Ruby Sass, that's a Ruby version that Gulp can run for you. So it's Gulp will run whatever compiler you want.
So I do need a compiler beforehand, and then Gulp.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, Gulp will run it for you.
Okay.
Yep, and do other stuff.
Sorry, just another clarification.
Yeah.
So for the city guide styling, you said there will be 4 features for forms, tables, that sort of thing. So could that be general features like margin, padding, or
yes, they can be as long as they're improving the way that your form looks. So yeah, you can. They can be kind of generalized features.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Good question. Yep.
A question about the same topic. So for forms, does it have to be specifically the form selector, or could it be input text area?
Yeah, it can be anything.
Okay.
Yep. Good question. Hey, what's up?
So I just want to know how to format
Sure.
make it so that my header can have multiple tabs.
Okay. Cool.
And so would I need separate HTML files?
For different. For each tab would be a different section of your page.
Yeah, so I'm trying to make each tab into one of the places that I'm highlighting.
Gotcha.
So
Cool.
how would I?
Yeah. So probably 2 ways. One, the most basic would be to have them link to that section of your page, and it would just kind of jump down.
Okay.
But if you wanted it to not show any of the other content until you click that tab, really you have to use some JavaScript for that.
Oh.
So you could have some JavaScript that would say, okay, when you click this button, add this class, make it display block instead of display none, something like that.
Okay, so we don't.
Bootstrap will also do some of that for you. But yeah, they're just plain CSS and HTML. There's not a way to have everything hidden until you click a certain tab and then just that one will show up. But you could jump down to that portion of the page if you wanted to. Or if you could do separate files too. You could have like one .html and copy that same header to each file, and then when you click on it, it just goes to that page. That would work too.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if there was something that I like missed.
Yeah. There's no real easy way to do that without either having it be separate files or some JavaScript.
Oh, okay.
So cool. Good question. Hey, what's up?
Me either. I was wondering because I was talking to somebody about React. Are
Yeah.
we able to use that?
Yeah, we do. We'll dig into React. It'll be it's kind of like 2/3 of the way through the semester.
Oh,
So
okay. So it's like in the unit.
yeah, yep. Towards the end, we'll do React. So we'll do one React project, and then the final project you can use React if you like as well. So
Thank you.
yep, awesome. How it going? Hey, what's up?
So I missed first quiz because I wasn't feeling well.
Okay, sure.
We had it. Is there any way that I can make it up?
Yeah, so in the syllabus, there's a regrade request form. Fill that out to schedule the makeup. And but yeah, we should be able to figure something out for you.
Cool.
No problem. Yep, have a go.